And good evening, everybody. I am John O'Loughlin. Welcome to my channel. It's called Macduff Lives. And I'm so delighted to have back with us once again Chris Fogarty, the author of the Ireland, the Perfect Holocaust, the history of the years 1845 to 1850, which has been traditionally not called a Holocaust, but I think that's one of the great points of the book, and the proof is in the book. Here it is right behind me. It's it's really a fascinating and fabulous documentation of the reality of what went on in Ireland in those years. And the word Holocaust is exactly uh, well stated. So once again, it's an honor and a privilege to have Chris Fogarty back with us. Hello, Chris. How are you?
Hello, John. It's great to be back, and thank you very much.
Well, indeed, it's nice of you to join us again, and delighted to hear that your book is now in the third printing. Is that right?
The third and fourth hardcover U.S., the fourth Ireland edition is sold, all gone, and there's
Ah,
an Australian one. And so people are learning. There's an awful lot of learning going on. We were all taught in school in Ireland and in the States that it was a famine. And I used the word famine until some decades ago. I was researching the life of my grandfather, Kieran Fogarty, 1839 1923, who was a British soldier starting in 1857 when he was 18 until 1881, the year that the British military ceased the use of the cat of nine tails as a tool of military discipline. So he got out in 1881, and after a few years, he married a young woman with a bit of land, had nine children. My father was the last of the nine, born in 1904. Odd to say that when I was with my father in 2000, he could truthfully say, my father, speaking now, this is my father speaking, my father was born 161 years ago. So it's not many people alive who can make that statement. But in any event, Kieran had joined the British Army when he was 18 years of age. I've learned to be ashamed about that, except that his family had been evicted by English Lord Ashbrook from their tenancy in Ballykeely, Durrow, County Laois, then called Queen's County, and they did survive 1845, 1850, and in 1857 he walked to Abbey Laois and took the Queen's shilling. He joined the British Army and took the Queen's shilling, and spent some 20 some years in that British Army in Australia, where he transported gold down from the Bendigo and Ballarat mines, and then to New Zealand, where he helped to destroy the Maoris, sad to say, and from there to India, where he spent the rest of his career. Again, he retired in 1881, and his regiment, like most regiments that had many Irish soldiers, had been kept out of Ireland during the food removal. So what we had always been taught was a famine that had to do with a natural event, the failure of the potato crop. It turns out that it took more than half the British Army to perpetrate it. It took precisely 67 British regiments of its 126 regiment army to starve the people of Ireland by robbing them of their massive, abundant food crops. That was not a crime at the time because at that time, all of the Irish were tenants on multi thousand acre estates by the ownership of which was claimed by English landlords. They had been there for a very long time, and they remained there until 1900, 1910, when the British Army bought them out compulsorily, but at above market prices. And those who were not already living in England repatriated to England. Uh, my parents, like all, and I was a young teenager at the time, paid rents for so long as annual rents for so long as I was in Ireland until I came to the States. And like all farmers in Ireland, everyone paid annual rents to amortize what had been given to the departing English landlords who used to own Ireland, and also uh, biannual uh, rates, which taxes, which were also due on farmland. So that was paid. We paid those rents until the 1970s. I was long gone, but my parents continued to pay those rents to amortize what had been given to the one-time English landlords uh, to buy them out. And again, the amounts granted by the British government to their landlords in Ireland was so large, so above market, that the amortization period was set at 68.5 years. So you can know then that anything that is priced such that it takes 68.5 years to amortize it, that price is quite a bit above market, and that was the situation. So in other words, the people kept living as if they were still tenants until the 1970s, when at the end of that 68.5 years of payments of rents, that's when the the destitution of the Irish people that had been centuries in operation came to an end, and the so-called Celtic tiger began around that time, after that annual rent payment of millions was no longer extracted from the Irish people and sent to England. So
When
that's this. Go ahead.
when I when I first went to Ireland, it was 1980, and I remember, I was traveling by myself, and to get from Ennis out to the coast, it was only one way, and that was the bus, and it was the school bus as well as the public bus. And uh, at that time, I remember people speaking the word the Celtic tiger, but it hadn't really taken hold yet in West Clare. So I had the privilege of being with some of the real country of Ireland, just for a couple of weeks when I was younger. But I'll never forget it. The people that you meet, and just little phrases that just ring in your mind, because they're so clever with words in the country of Ireland. Wouldn't you agree?
Very much so. Yes, in fact, they take a little bit of pride in being original in their speech.
And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, I think that they're you speak Irish, and I've always heard that Irish is a much more nuanced language than English. So to take a a, a look at English from a more nuanced way, and to create your own phrases to make it sound right.
Yes, where I was raised in North County Galway before my parents bought their little farm in County Roscommon across the River Sook, the people were speaking English but with Irish grammar, which is interesting. And but the accents were so strong that as a 10-year-old recently in Ireland from Chicago with my mother and brothers and sisters, and the following year my father and older brothers, I couldn't understand a word that the people were saying, even though they were speaking English. But they were speaking with Irish grammar, but using English words, with a tremendous number of Irish words interspersed.
That's
So,
fascinating.
yes,
Uh, I was traveling, with in the time of the great Michael Russell, of Doolin in County Clare, who was famous over here, among us trad heads, as a real traditional whistle player, and singer and storyteller. And so I was there, catching that, and his beautiful voice, just the spoken voice. It's almost musical. Like they say about Italian, it sounds like musical. I think the traditional sound of the West Clare Irish was very, very musical, just to hear it.
yes, I agree. And the same thing is true of the people in West Mayo and West Galway. I
Sure.
really love those accents also. Yeah, however, it's fading away. And when I think of those beautiful, sweet accents, I must say it is partly with a sense of loss that it is passing.
Hmm. Uh, if you're not aware of it, there's a movie called Joe's Garage, which talks a bit about that. It's anyway. Well, last time we were together, we went through your book, and uh, I've studied it since then. Of course, you were kind enough to leave a copy with me, and I'm grateful for that. But the big thing in the book to me is the visualization, and to do that, I'm just going to bring that map up that you created. It's just a fabulous document. So let's start with that, and give me a second to get it up on the screen.
Good.
Okay, so this is the map that you get with the book, and it's not, I mean, it's a big fold out map. It's not just a page size. It's like a, three page size. It's big. And this is called the mass graves of Ireland. And let's start there, because I want to just tell the folks that since we last talked about this, I've studied and looked at it closely, and I could see that there was one of those mass graves right in my ancestral home of Ennistimon in the county of Clare on the west coast of Ireland. So I'm going to focus in on that in a minute, but introduce us to the map, those of us that haven't heard about it yet, and I can bring in. I can magnify it if you want to bring in a particular part of it.
Okay. Um, this map uh, it abolishes the notion of famine, including potato famine. These 67 regiments, each Union Jack you see there, each tiny little icon, Union Jack, um, is a British regiment, and each regiment is shown only once, and it is shown where it had its longest period of deployment in Ireland. They were the third line of offense in robbing actually the Irish of their food crops. The first line of defense was the constabulary. They were led by English officers, but there were quite a few Irish among them. Approximately half of them were Irish. They were sent out to to rob the people of their food crops. Uh, when they ran into difficulty, which was, I guess, much of the time, they were joined by one of the 37 county militia regiments that were commanded by English landlords in Ireland. There was one for each county of those militia regiments, and there were three in County Cork, two in Dublin, two in Mayo, and two in Limerick. So that accounts for the 37 regiments, even though there are only 32 counties in Ireland. But when both of those armed forces and the constabulary at the time had carbine rifles, when both of those armed forces ran into difficulty in robbing the Irish of their food crops, only then would the nearest British regular army regiment be summoned. And they were stationed, they moved around within Ireland a lot. They were typically about a year and a half or so in each location. So the same regiment might be all over the country for the whole 6 year period. Um, the the 68th of Foot was in most towns in Ireland over that period. In fact, there were a number of detachments, company size, I think, or brigade size, that were deployed simultaneously in different parts of Ireland. But their function was to remove the food at gunpoint. And you might notice that they're sort of concentrated more or less in the middle of Ireland. And that's partly due to, well, the North was there were such a high proportion of English descended people and Scottish descended people in the six counties of the North that they were able to get the food away without having to summon the regular British Army. And the same in County Sligo here. And West Mayo, the land is so poor that there wasn't a whole lot of food to be removed except mountain goats and sheep and things like that. Though grain was removed from Belmullet up on the northwest corner. And you can see that each of those arrows is a food extraction route. The the grain loading and flour loading and cattle loading facilities were at the nearest ports there. And so they were removed out of the country and typically to England, but the food was sold to the benefit of the then English landlords who claimed ownership of the food on the basis that it was grown on their land, and therefore all the work done in growing it and saving it and cultivating and saving and harvesting was all their property, even though it was all done by the Irish. So that's how the whole Ireland ran for a number of centuries. Beside each Union Jack, one can see the name of that specific regiment. And as you said, John, the 41st had removed the food from your particular area of North County Clare. In South County Clare, there was one landlord, Vandeleur, right in there at Kilrush, right at, at the southern end of County Clare. You can see Kilrush, and that area and all the region around it was owned by English landlord Vandeleur. Uh, he murdered some tens of thousands of people on quote his unquote estate, and in fact it was some 20,000 acres at the beginning of the genocide, and he added some 4 or 5 thousand acres to it during the genocide. Odd to say that the street names in that town of Kilrush to this day are the names of the old genocidal English landlord Vandeleur, and one street is named for him, another street for his wife, a street for his son and his daughter-in-law, and his own daughter or two daughters. So all of the streets in the town are named for the people who used to murder the population of that community. Another feature of the Vandeleur family is that Crofton Vandeleur, son of Lord Vandeleur, the landlord, the son was married to the daughter of Lord Lord Norbury. Lord Norbury was the judge who in 1803 sentenced to death and decapitation the 25-year-old Robert Emmet. Uh, and you might, many of your listeners might be aware of the speech from the dock. It's immortal, I think, by Robert Emmet upon being sentenced. Uh, Part of it was borrowed by Winston Churchill later in his "We shall fight them on the landing field. We shall fight them on the. We shall not surrender." That was by 25-year-old Robert Emmet in 1803, and it is quite eloquent. And of course, he was hanged and beheaded a few days later. Again, the daughter of the judge, Lord Norbury, who sentenced the 25-year-old Robert Emmet to death and decapitation, that judge's daughter was married to the son of the landlord in Kilrush. So that might interest some of your. And then in the case of County Kerry, you'll notice that there's no garrison town for the regular British Army in County Kerry, because much of that county, there it is right there, but much of that county, essentially all of it, was owned by Lord Lansdowne uh, and Trinity College in Dublin. Lord Lansdowne had earlier been named Lord Shelburne. So Lord Shelburne and Lord Lansdowne are essentially the same entity. So between that double named Lord Lansdowne and and Shelburne, that County Kerry was largely owned by them and Trinity College in Dublin. Trinity College was uh, was built by Queen Elizabeth I, and only the children of landlords could attend, the English in Ireland could attend that school for centuries, and and it was the richest, most endowed, of course, college or university in all of Europe because it had thousands of people slaving away on these lands, for which all of the income went to maintain Trinity College.
My goodness, I never knew that any of that. That's fascinating. The entire county of Kerry, which is huge, uh,
Yes.
all of those farms, all of the sheep, all of the produce was there to support this college. And when you say Lord Shelburne, I think he's one of those really dark members of the British Parliament. I can't remember which one he is, but he was back there with Palmerston and them, right?
Yes. He later became known as Lord Lansdowne. I don't know why he happened to change his name, but it's the same family. Uh, but Lansdowne, and while he was Lord Shelburne, they did their own consumption. So their consumption did not go to Trinity. So it was only the part of County Kerry that was owned by Trinity directly that kept Trinity sustained, the richest university in Ireland. But the its land in Kerry, which was something like, maybe 30% of its tens of thousands of acres in Ireland, many tens of thousands, they had, Trinity College was supported by estates in some 8 or 10 Irish counties, where they got all of the proceeds from the production of the people living as tenants on that Trinity land in all of those counties. But that's how that operated. So it might be seem kind of odd that the British regiments are located where they are. Now they did move around a lot, but they tend to move back into those same garrison towns, um, and they were there for 6 years, from 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 the 1st of January 1845 through the the 1st of January 1851, a total of 6 years. But they weren't all there for the entire 6 years. Some of them moved in to Ireland, and some departed Ireland. So, as the book shows every movement made by every one of those 67 regiments throughout its entire period in Ireland. So, they weren't all in Ireland for all 6 of those years. Uh, Many of them were, but not all. But the dates of the entry and departure from each Irish area is recorded in the book, and that comes directly from the British government's own records. Uh, the disposition of the army for each year, 1845 through 1850, the end of 1850. I have original copies, true copies, made by the Public Record Office at the time. Now it's the National Archives in Kew outside London, in Surrey, outside London, where I must say I received very helpful advice and direction from the people working there. They were not inclined to conceal Britain's crimes of genocide, uh, and so that was pleasant. The Irish government, however, is more captive of the British than the people who work at the National Archives of Britain. The Irish government are very much opposed to any acknowledgement of what was done in those years. If you'll go back to that map again for a second, if you can,
Oh
the
yeah.
the mass graves are are each is marked on that map by a little cross, a little white cross, and uh, but I was only able to get about probably less than There's some 180 of these little crosses. Each one of those crosses is marks the location of a mass grave. Um, there are about 180 shown on this map. Most of them are where there were workhouses at the time, and they would be the largest numbers of mass burials in Ireland. They were there, but the mass graves of Ireland of those years are scattered across the country. The number of crosses would hardly fit on the map. They're probably on the order of 3,000, uh, what can be called mass graves. But the ones you see here on this map are almost all at the location of workhouses at the time that were really deadly. Starting in 1846, the British government ordered workhouse masters to have their inmates dig 12-foot deep pits in the grounds of the workhouses. And typically, in the workhouses of lesser mortality, uh, it, each 12-foot pit would take about a week's supply of the dead from that workhouse. Uh, in many cases, in a great many cases, uh, the number of dead and the pits that were dug for the dead in that workhouse exceeded the amount of available land on of those grounds, and the grounds were typically of 6 acres, and the people were the workhouse masters and the board of guardians, they were called the board of guardians, would acquire land nearby where they would bury the overflow in other 12-foot deep pits. My the landlord of my great grandfather on my mother's side, uh, my the landlord named my great grandfather to be the flag catcher for the community for him. He named him one of the guardians of the Glenamaddy, County Galway workhouse, and that was to save himself from confrontations with the local people who were trying to get in or get out or whatever regarding that workhouse. But it wasn't built until 1851, when the genocide was over. I have included it on the map, however, because the killing continued for as long as the English landlords were in Ireland. The the evictions, there were 250,000 people, Irish, evicted by those landlords in those years, and continuing until the landlords themselves were bought out in 1900, 1910. And the eviction from your house and land in Ireland was essentially a death sentence. The the temperature in Ireland is averages 39 degrees in wintertime, not too cold, 56 degrees in summertime, and pretty constantly wet. So that there was death by exposure and, of course, by starvation. And people wandered across the country until into oblivion until they lay down and died. There was a penalty for anyone who might take in an evicted family, and that would be that they would be evicted themselves by their landlord. It was called the rules of the estate. And anyone who gave shelter to an evicted family would themselves be evicted and their house torn down by the local landlord. It's too tragic to even contemplate today, and yet we must learn the truth no matter what, because we must confront it, and we must try to learn something from it, and we must try to avoid that kind of thing forever. Though talking about this in the light of what is being done now by COVID and its vaccines becomes a little bit. You would wonder whether we should not be redirecting efforts. So this is, however, the map of Ireland of those years, and that's where not the majority of the people were buried, but where a great many of them were buried at those little white crosses. And again, those white crosses most of them are at the sites of workhouses.
We have
When
uh, we have the White Cross at Ennis-Diamond there, which I followed up to get a web page, which is descriptive of the workhouse right there, and we actually have a picture of the workhouse. I want to share that screen for just a second so people can see, because this is a place that my ancestors came from, and if I was able to visit this workhouse and find where they buried those bones in those graves that they had to dig, I would, I think that would be quite a quite a feeling, because that's my bones going back, into
Yes,
ancient history. Um, Let me see if I can share this. Stop that one and get the other one up. Right. So, Ennis Diamond, County Clare, Poor Law Union was formally declared on the 3rd of August, 1839, and covered an area of 238 square miles. It was overseen by an elected board of guardians, as you just mentioned, 21 in
yes,
number, representing 13 electoral districts. It lists the areas of County Clare, which is a huge amount of the towns, including, of course, Innis Diamond and Liscannor, Milltown, Malbay, the names from Irish music that so many of us in the trad Irish world have known for years and years. The uh, workhouse itself is a picture taken in 2003. Uh, you can see it there, kind of.
yes. That would be just a portion of it. They were typically in the shape of a large H or even double H's. And the weird thing about these mass graves and workhouse sites today is that the Irish government puts up little. They acknowledge the existence, but they acknowledge the existence of the workhouse, the structure, and nothing about the people who were in those workhouses. You'll find essentially nothing about the numbers who died in each of those workhouses. Just the just the dates of the of the construction of it. This is really weird to me. You would wonder, why would the Irish government today, 170 years after the fact, be continuing to conceal a genocide of their own people? And that is what is happening. And anyone can see that by going to those old workhouse sites and seeing what little marker has been installed there by the local community with government approval. It's shocking stuff that there's no mention of any human connection to those places, no mention of the mass graves. In fact, the Irish government is very willing and has always been very willing to give planning permission to build housing developments on top of those mass graves, obliterating them. Uh, the my best buddy, schoolmate in Castlereagh, County Roscommon, later became an excavation contractor operating construction equipment as they first came into Ireland in those years after I left Ireland. And he sort of semi whispered to me one day while I was in Ireland. And he, at the time, he was raising a small family, little toddlers. And he told me that he had excavated the remains of hundreds of entangled bodies
Oh,
of toddlers and dumped them into a truck and hauled them away until the word got out and the scandal forced stoppage of the project, and the number of houses had to be um, decreased, had to be reduced in order to leave some areas undesecrated. But they desecrated large areas. The entire lands on which the workhouses were built were eventually filled with the 12-foot deep pits of the dead inmates of those places. And and yet the Irish government is not alone content to issue planning permission for housing development or any other construction atop them, but they're anxious to do it and have been doing it. We were able to stop one planning the sale of land for a housing development atop the Killala mass grave. Killala is on the north coast of County Mayo. We were able to stop that one some years ago. It's still stopped. We don't know how much of it is due to our own efforts and the efforts of the local people, and how much to the fact that the economy has not been conducive toward new developments for the last few years. But in any event, at least that one desecration, encouraged by the Irish government, has not gone ahead. Strange,
Uh,
isn't it? Go ahead.
well, you have made a few comments about the Irish government that I'd like to explore a little bit more. Who do they work for? What is this still British banks that are pulling the strings? How do you explain, the fact that the Irish government is in so many ways abusive of the Irish people?
I can only, I have many, how would you call it? There are many indications, but there are a few facts that tend to allow one to know why. Um, there was an election in 1918, in, in November and December of 1918, in which the Irish people freed themselves. 75 districts of Ireland's 110 or so voted in Sinn Féin, and they formed a new government on the 15th of January 1919. They were the government of Ireland by the duly elected government that had been overseen by the British government. But the British government responded to that election by the Irish people by referring to the elected government as an illegal assembly, and set about killing and imprisoning the elected members of the Irish government. Uh, that there was essentially a war at the time, but on the 6th of December of 1921, the British government set up a new Dáil Éireann, a new government of Ireland, of their own, by Lloyd George and King George V. And all subsequent governments of Ireland have been successors to that regime set up by the British government. And that is the only explanation that I can think of. But then, why do the people of Ireland continue to vote into office such traitors to their own country? And I don't know how or why that happens, other than to think that they vote people in who they are encouraged to believe will do the right thing. Some of them are their own neighbors, but the British government tends to be able, by either bribery or blackmail, to get those elected officials to do British bidding as opposed to Irish bidding. That's the way it has always gone on. Ireland is now run by the international deep state. Its people are, I think, there's a larger percentage of vaccinated people in Ireland than in any other country. And it's very sad to watch, because their ancestors had they had lost their, what, 10% of their population every generation by rising for justice and being executed by the British government. And here we now have what is nominally a free Irish people, and yet they have not freed themselves. They're the workhouses, the old British workhouses, in which thousands died in each of them, and are buried on the surrounding land outside the doors of those old workhouses. The Irish government to this day conceals the fact what went on in those workhouses, conceals the fact that even the numbers who are buried in those workhouse grounds, and refer to those workhouses in petty little markers as somehow that the workhouses themselves are what ought to be acknowledged and not the people who died within them. It's bizarre, but yet that's what goes on. Uh, to talk about the number of Irish, the millions of Irish dead of those years will typically result in some Irish TV reporter or radio reporter from Radio Television or some newspaper editor to insist upon talking about the the Shoah, the Jewish Holocaust of Second World War, and uh, the Minister for Justice of Ireland some 20 years ago, a Jew by the name of Shatter, he complained that there were not enough memorials in Ireland to the Jewish Holocaust. And I must say, I sympathize with him and his concern about the number of Jews and others murdered by the Nazis. But how many memorials exist in Israel to the Irish Holocaust? And I don't happen to know of any. And and the number murdered during the Holocaust of the Irish was far greater than the number that actually were murdered of Jews by the Nazis. That number, that 6 million, is, and I don't want to engage in a new, how do you call it, controversy, but the 6 million was fraudulent from the very beginning. It started in the 1880s, including in the New York Times newspapers, and it continued to the present day. 6 million all the way through, and uh, there has been a number of revelations that our news media, our U.S. news media, do not want to know about. The son of the internationally famous violinist Yehudi Menuhin, the son, Gerard, living in Germany, has written a book that demolishes the whole notion of 6 million. It is entitled Tell the Truth and Shame the Devil, written again by Gerard Menuhin, son of the Israeli violinist. And it tells it precisely how many died in all of the Nazi run concentration camps. And so it's no longer a mystery, but it is hard to believe that somehow that fake, that hugely overstated genocide is the one that we are required to acknowledge while continuing to conceal an actual one of about 5.2 million in Ireland. So that's the crazy world we live in. Uh, Holocaust. Uh, the Irish actually have a proprietary moral claim to the label of Holocaust. And again, this is no put down of any Jewish suffering or any diminution of what the Nazis did, but the Holocaust was first used contemporaneously while the Holocaust was underway. It was written as such by Michael Davitt and by James Fitzgerald. And starting on May 4, 1846, and continuing until November 19, 1855, the Cork Examiner newspaper in County Cork reported it frequently as Holocaust. And again, that was continually, repeatedly throughout May 4, 1846 until November 19, 1855. It was called Holocaust as to what was going on in all of Ireland at the time. That Cork Examiner newspaper is still exists. It is now the Irish Examiner newspaper. At that time, it was based in County Cork, and now it has become it was reporting nationally at the time regarding Holocaust, but now it is more a national newspaper than the provincial one or state or county one it used to be. But there is the establishment of the right to refer to Holocaust. And in such matters, prior usage, precedent usage, does make a difference. And again, it was used in Ireland a century before what was done in Poland and Germany and other places where the Nazis had their camps. Most of those camps, by the way, in those places were work camps for the main war, the the war factories, Krupp and Bayer,
Right.
and a few others.
We have.
And go ahead.
I was just going to say we have on the back of your book a quote from a very famous uh, journalist, John Pilger, who says the Anglo-American publishing establishment will still kill any book that tells the truth about the starvation of Ireland. And well, I guess that's kind of what you've been saying. But when you have this kind of denial, um, it's coming from, as you say, the deep state. Um, I think this is in keeping the Irish Holocaust covered up. Maybe it's easier for them to commit another Holocaust somewhere else. And I'm thinking right now of Afghanistan, where I think the people over there right now are facing a very difficult situation. And food is going to be scarce, but our powers that be, they're not going to do anything. It's like those people don't even exist. And if those of us, who recognize the true horror of the Irish experience in the 19th century, and particularly those 5 years that you've written about in such detail, that it might help people to understand that we have to do something when uh, disaster looms, no matter where it is in the world. And I think that that again, to me, keeping this covered up is part of their power.
That is so well said. If we have any lesson that we can learn from any genocide, any Holocaust, it is to bring them all to an end the political policies of genocide. Uh, we couldn't, shortly after my book was first in pamphlet form and had went out in huge hundreds of thousands of, I think, close to a million photocopies were made and distributed throughout mostly the Anglophone world. Uh, Shortly after that, the FBI framed me for the murder of three people I'd never heard of in my life. And I didn't even know that I had been framed yet, and they did not arrest me because the actual murderer, 16-year-old David Biro, who had used FBI agent Lewis's 357 Magnum to do the killing of his neighbors in Winnetka, Illinois, he finally, and this 16-year-old used to bring his fellow students on tours of the murder scene, but they never went to the authorities until he told them about his next plan, which was to cut through the roof of the local bank in Winnetka, uh, rob it, loot its safe deposit boxes into a duffel bag that he would have with him, wait for the staff to arrive in the morning, murder them all, and walk out undetected. So his classmates then all of a sudden they were, though they had known about the previous murders by him, by their having advanced knowledge, they were now accomplices or would be accomplices. So they must have talked to their parents, and then they went to the local police, and the murder weapon was found in David Biro's bedroom, and the glass cutter that he used to get into the house. So he was tried for a triple murder and was convicted. That saved me. Uh, but the FBI had not arrested me for those murders, even though there was only one murderer according to the police investigation report, and that was me, according to words that they claimed that I uttered to them. So uh, we couldn't understand. So within a day or two of David Biro's conviction in court in on the north side of Chicago in Skokie, Illinois, the FBI, same agent Buckley who had framed me for that triple murder, burst through our door with a gang of fellow agents, all with drawn guns, and they locked my wife and me up in the federal jail in downtown Chicago in case 91 CRF criminal 911. Odd numbers, but in any event, that's the name of the case. And it took us 15 months and a fortune of our savings and 7 attorneys, but eventually the U.S. prosecutor, James Fleissner, had to plead U.S. Judge George Lindbergh to be allowed to abandon all charges, which the judge granted. Neither of them had any choice because the only evidence against us, an FBI audio tape, had already been proven to be a criminal fabrication. And so instead of arresting that perpetrator, FBI agent Buckley, and his accomplices, the government sent Buckley to Ireland, where he remained from 1994 until the evening of 15 August 1998, upon mission accomplished. Their mission in Ireland was to free up the British Army for use in the neocons' planned wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, etc. And he went to Ireland, and there they remained until the 15th of August 1998, the bombing murder in Omagh of 29 innocent people, to be blamed just like the Biro's murders in Chicago, on the IRA. Buckley had gotten the news media of Chicago to report falsely that the murders of the Langard family somehow involved the IRA. Again, a complete fabrication, but it made a big difference at the time. The same FBI agent in Ireland infiltrated the local real IRA, and to the point of his 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 mole, um, Richard David Rupert, participating in a rehearsal of the Omagh bombing. He boasted about his rehearsal of that bombing to his MI5 handling boss in London by email. And the bombing went ahead, and 29 people were murdered, and it was blamed upon the IRA, even though it was mission accomplished for that FBI MI5 team in Ireland. That murder was what did free up the British Army. And when I say that it was mission accomplished, the British Army were freed up from Ireland by that defeat of the IRA. The murder of the 29 people by MI5 and the FBI did defeat the IRA. They lost public support in Ireland from that very bombing. And that defeated the IRA, which freed up the British Army and allowed the deep state to proceed with their planned wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and all the rest of those tragedies, supreme crimes, according to the United Nations post World War II. So that's how what has gone on, and the Irish government were accomplices with those MI5 FBI crimes against their own people. And I later, uh, I didn't have all this information, but having gone through of FBI crimes against me here in Chicago, once we learned that they were going to be trying to imprison an Irishman in Ireland, we never heard of that Irishman, Michael McKevitt. but he's a brother-in-law of Bobby Sands. He's married to Bobby Sands' sister. We knew about Bobby Sands, but we were
Hmm.
not involved in the politics of at the time. We were disinformed. We tended to believe the U.S. news media about the Marxist, Leninist, terrorist IRA, and we were not really much involved. But in any event, knowing that Buckley was now operating in Ireland and that he had framed me for a triple murder of people I love, and I was saved only by the murderer who blabbed through his FBI cover into life without parole, and then later had 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 locked me up and my wife up and two others in the federal jail in Chicago and tried to imprison us for the rest of our lives. My wife and I thought we've got to do what we can for this other man in Ireland. So we went up to where David Rupert, the FBI mole, the man who had infiltrated the IRA, where he had come from in Waddington, New York, up on the St. Lawrence River. And and we went to Messina, where he lived most of his life as an adult, a, a, a professional criminal, according to the New York State Police. In fact, the New York State Police issued an affidavit that was introduced into evidence into the trial of Michael McKevitt in Dublin, that David Rupert, the FBI mole who was involved in the bombing of Omagh, that he that he was a lifelong criminal. And but however, that did not stop the Irish government from using him as their essentially sole witness, and that's what they did. And so we watched this going forward. We it was just shocking to see the same FBI agent who had committed all those crimes against us in Chicago and had not been arrested for those crimes. To see him essentially in charge of the trial of McKevitt, walking around, strutting around as if he owned the courtroom. And that happened to be the self same courtroom where 200 years, almost to the week, that Lord Norbury had sentenced the 25-year-old Robert Emmett to be hanged and beheaded in the self same room, but 200 years difference. The only difference between the two trials was that Robert Emmett, in his speech from the dock, denounces the fact that that his sentence was ensured by the very selection of the jury panel, while 200 years later, Michael McKevitt got no jury at all. So, so how things have changed in Ireland in 200 years. Under British rule, it was a corrupt jury that had been selected to achieve the conviction. But in so-called free Ireland, the defendant got no jury at all. The Irish people could not be depended upon to come up with the required deep state conviction. So Michael McKevitt was, in fact, convicted and was sentenced to 14 years in prison. And we visited him a few times in prison. And then he got cancer in prison, and he died within a few months of the end of his sentence of 14 years. It's one of the great tragedies of our time, and yet the deep state rules. Nothing can be done about it. They now seem to be involved in, we'll have to see, it seems to be a planned population reduction of the globe. Uh, and we're looking at the evidence, and it's starting to accumulate,
I
and
agree with you.
it's looking an awful lot like
Yeah.
a genocide of of the whole world.
Stick with us here at McDuff Lives. We're working on that here, and we're doing shows on that subject all the time. And I think we're in a real crisis. Uh, I have called for a moratorium on the jabs. I think the best thing we can do right now is just stop jabbing people and take a breath and step back and look at what the effect has been, and let ourselves really consider whether this is the right way to take humanity, because I don't think that anybody that would really consider it carefully would want to keep going in this direction. It's a tragedy that I see it in your eyes, Chris. I know you're worried about it, and I'm worried about it, and we all have to do what we can. I wish we had another hour to keep going, but I think we're going to have to wrap it up pretty soon. Um, would you like to share a way to get in touch with you and also to obtain copies of your book?
Yes, thank you very much, John. Um, Either through my telephone directly, I'll send you a, how you call it, a signed copy. You can reach me through fogartyc at att.net. Again, that's Fogarty, Fogartyc at att.net, or by calling me at 312-437-3189. It's also available on Amazon and again, the title of the book is Ireland 1845 1850, The Perfect Holocaust, and Who Kept It, quote, perfect, unquote. Again, Ireland 1845 1850, The Perfect Holocaust, and Who Kept It, quote, perfect, unquote. John, I really appreciate this, and I'm hoping that the current threat to all of us, to every single one of us, except some unknowns of the 1%, who obviously have not included themselves or their own families in these jabs. Will I'm thinking now that it's going to come to a head soon. Too many doctors and too many scientists are now speaking out. We've learned why the entire medical profession have not spoken out, and it is that their licenses would be removed if they were to speak out. And so they are gripped that their livelihoods, their means of providing for their families are hostage to these criminals. And so, but if the numbers can just increase a little more, and if we, the people, refuse to participate, maybe we can stop it. I would like your opinion on this, John, because I'm only learning this. I have been kind of slow to learn. I did not want to believe that the entire government is run by an international criminal deep state, and yet that is what we seem to have. But what do you think about about our prospects for survival?
It's all about communication. It's all about having a way to spread the word. I mean, you've got the word. I can hear that you understand the situation, and you're a writer. You've done a lot of public events and speaking, and that's all we can do. We just have to let people see, us with speaking from the heart. If we speak from the heart, the other people's hearts are going to listen. We have to believe that at some point this mass psychosis is going to fall apart. As you say, it can't stand forever because it's fake. The truth will come out. But I am with you. I am very concerned about it, and I'm grateful for your concern and for asking my opinion. I say let's just keep doing what we're doing, Chris. We have to just keep on talking. I do 5, 6, 7 shows a week, and I try to encourage people to talk about it. We have to talk about it, even if our family doesn't want to talk about it. We have to talk to somebody. And the tragedy is that the media is so tightly controlled. I can't, people in Europe, I have correspondents. I can't say close friends, but people I talk to fairly often in Ireland. And I don't think that there's a single one of them that has your perspective. They've all, what do they have to look at? Uh, Sky News, um, Rupert Murdoch products, BBC, for Christ's sake. I mean, anybody that thinks they're going to get any truth from the BBC had better get their head examined quickly, or else just give up on reality because it's not there. I could go on for hours about this, Chris. It's a terrible, terrible human tragedy that's unfolding right now in our lives, and we feel helpless. I mean, how do you fight? the deep state, except for as long as we have a breath to speak, we have to just keep speaking it. And that just goes right back to the whole tragedy of the Holocaust in Ireland, and we can't, you know, never again, right?
That's where we are, John. Again, it does me good to hear you so aware of the situation, and there are some people's words have more value than others. And there's a Dr. Robert Malone,
Oh,
and there's
geez, don't start on him now.
oh,
We'll be
and there's
here
a
all night.
okay, and there's a Dr. McCulloch, and there's a Dr. Dolores Cahill in Ireland, and
Yeah,
and I think we need to spread what they're doing. I think because they're at the forefront of this. They're the ones who are risking all. They're the targets of the criminals. And so we must be seen, we must support them and be seen to be supporting them and spread the word.
I'll toss out another name which I've been really fascinated with, and that's Dr. Zev Zelenko,
Exactly.
Zelenko. I would say that would be my first choice if I was starting into this journey. I would leave Robert Malone for later because he's a very, very complex story, and it's not all good, believe me.
Oh, I see. Okay. Well, then, Zelenko, I'm aware of Zelenko also, but thank you for that tip. And I'll certainly be focusing upon spreading the word of Dr. Zelenko.
All right. Thanks everybody for being with us. Thanks for staying a few minutes late, Chris. And everybody, St. Patty's Day is not that far away. And if you need a gift for a favorite relative or friend, I can't think of anything better than to give them a copy of Chris's great book, Ireland 1845 to 50, The Perfect Holocaust and Who Kept It. Perfect.
Thank you again, John.
Thank you.